The night was supposed to be a celebration, a lavish dinner prepared by the family's trusted chef. Set in the grand dining room of a luxurious mansion, the rich scent of gourmet food filled the air. As the table sparkled under the soft glow of chandelier lights, it was a moment of triumph for the family, a gathering to honor years of hard work and success. But as the clinking of silverware echoed through the room, one voice shattered the peace with a whispered confession that no one could have anticipated. "Mother put poison in your dinner." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. A young man, no older than 25, leaned in close to his father, his voice low and trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. His eyes were wide, scanning the room as if expecting someone to hear, to notice. The father, a man of towering presence, strong and unyielding, was the head of a vast empire, a man who had built his fortune from the ground up, a true self-made millionaire. His reputation was untouchable, but in that moment, as his son's words reached his ears, something shifted in him. Was it disbelief, or was it the cold grip of reality setting in? As the father stared at his son, his mind raced. His first instinct was to dismiss the statement, to assume it was some kind of sick joke. But the look in his son's eyes, the desperation, the rawness of the fear, couldn't be ignored. The young man, usually so composed and poised, now looked like he had seen a ghost. And it wasn't just the words that were unnerving. It was the way the son seemed to be silently pleading for his father to believe him. For years, this family had seemed untouchable, like a well-oiled machine that could never falter. The father, a wealthy business tycoon, had always maintained control of everything in his life, from his companies to his relationships. He had everything anyone could ever want: power, money, respect. And yet, in this one instant, as he sat across from his wife, the woman who had been by his side for decades, everything began to unravel. Could it be true? Could the woman he loved, the mother of his children, really be capable of something so sinister? Or was this just some misunderstanding? The dinner had begun innocently enough, with the usual banter between the family members. But as the evening progressed, something began to feel off. His wife, normally vibrant and full of life, had seemed distant, almost cold. She'd barely touched her own plate, though she'd smiled at him with her usual charm. It was as if she was hiding something, but what could it possibly be? The family was tight-knit, seemingly impenetrable, but even the strongest relationships have their cracks, and it was becoming clear that there were secrets buried beneath the surface, secrets that no one dared to speak of until now. The son's words echoed in the father's mind. Poison! The very idea was absurd. But what if it wasn't? What if it was true? Was this some twisted betrayal, an act of desperation, or a calculated attempt to take everything from him? He glanced at his wife across the table, trying to decipher her expression. She smiled back, but there was something off about it, something forced, almost too perfect. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from festive to tense in a heartbeat. The laughter had died down, replaced by the quiet clinking of glasses and the occasional murmur of nervous conversation. The servants, too, seemed to have picked up on the change in energy, moving around the room with a quiet, uncertain air. The once cheerful ambience had transformed into something heavy, like a thick fog that made it hard to breathe. Why would she do something like that? The son asked, his voice barely audible, but his words cutting through the thick tension like a knife. Why would she want to kill you? The father didn't answer immediately. His mind raced as he thought about everything that had led to this moment. His wife had always been supportive, but lately there had been cracks in their marriage, small almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, they had grown. She had become more distant, more secretive. He had brushed it off, telling himself it was just the stress of their busy lives, the pressures of managing a fortune. But now, in the silence of that room, with his son's accusation hanging between them, he couldn't ignore the possibility that something much darker was at play. His thoughts drifted to the past few weeks, the strange behavior, the late nights, the odd phone calls that she had quickly dismissed when he asked. Could it be that his wife had grown tired of him, tired of the life they had built together? Or was there something deeper at play, something more sinister, like jealousy or greed? The son, looking pale and anxious, continued to stare at his father, waiting for some sort of reaction. The father's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: betrayal, confusion, fear. He had never imagined this moment would come. He had always been in control, always the one holding the cards. But now, for the first time in years, he felt powerless. "Do you think I'm lying?" the son asked, his voice shaky but firm. The father, his heart pounding, looked up at him. "I don't know," he whispered, his words barely escaping his lips. "But if what you're saying is true, then this changes everything." A heavy silence fell over the room as the realization set in. The father knew this was no longer just about dinner or a family gathering. It was about survival. Who could he trust now? His wife, his own son. The very foundation of his life seemed to be crumbling, and in its place, a chilling uncertainty began to rise. As the father slowly stood up from the table, his eyes never leaving his wife's face, his mind raced. What would he do next? Could he confront her in front of everyone? Or should he wait, bide his time, and investigate the truth for himself? The room seemed to close in on him, the weight of his thoughts pressing down harder with every passing second. The glass in his hand trembled ever so slightly, a silent reflection of the turmoil he was feeling inside. And then, as his gaze met his wife's for the briefest of moments, he knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But would it come at a cost he was willing to pay? The suspense was unbearable. The dinner, once a celebration, had now become a battleground. And as the father stood there, torn between love and suspicion, his next move would decide everything. But what would he do next? Would he confront his wife, or would he let the night unfold on its own? The father stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, struggling to process what his son had just said. Every word seemed to echo in his ears, bouncing around his skull, like a distant, unshakable truth. Poison, his wife, the woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, was accused of trying to end his life. But how could it be true? Could she really betray him in such a way? His thoughts swirled with a mix of disbelief and fear, but there was no escaping the chilling reality. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. He looked at his son again, searching for something, anything, that might give him a reason to dismiss the accusation. But the look in his eyes was unmistakable. His son, typically so composed, was now on the edge of panic. The tension was suffocating, like an invisible hand gripping at the air around them. It was clear that whatever had prompted this confession, whatever had led to this moment, was not just a passing fear. It was something deep and real. "I swear, Dad," his son whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I saw her do it. I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. She said she couldn't let you ruin everything we've worked for. That if you didn't die tonight, everything would fall apart." The words hit the father like a ton of bricks. He had always been aware of the pressure his success had placed on his family, the weight of expectation that came with being a millionaire. But he had never imagined that his wife, his partner, would be the one to crack under the strain. The idea of her plotting against him, orchestrating his downfall from the shadows, was too much to grasp. And yet, as the son's words sank in, the reality of it started to settle in like a dark cloud on the horizon. His wife, a woman who had always seemed so strong, so capable, had always been there by his side, supporting him through the highs and lows of his empire. They had raised 2 children together, built a life that many only dreamed of. But beneath the surface, there had always been an undercurrent of tension, something unspoken between them. In the early years, they had been a power couple, inseparable, unstoppable. But as the years went on, as his wealth and influence grew, something began to change. The passion that once fueled their relationship had faded, replaced by routine and unspoken resentment. He had noticed it, but hadn't wanted to face it. Could it be that she had been harboring a deeper grudge, something that had been festering for years, just waiting for the right moment to erupt? His mind began to wander back to their earlier years together. She had been there when he was nothing but a young entrepreneur with a dream, struggling to make ends meet. She had believed in him when no one else did, and together they had built something extraordinary. He couldn't reconcile that woman with the one who might be capable of such betrayal. But then again, he thought, things were never as they seemed. Was it possible that he had missed the signs? Was this all just a result of his blind ambition, his focus on building his empire while neglecting the cracks in his personal life? The tension in the room grew unbearable. The servants had quietly retreated into the background, unsure of what was happening, their expressions tense and uncertain. The silence was deafening. The father couldn't look at his wife now. The smile she had offered him earlier, the warmth in her eyes, felt like a lie. How long had she been planning this? Was there something more sinister going on? He needed to know. "I have to see for myself," he muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. He wasn't sure if it was to convince himself or to reassure his son. But the words felt heavy with finality. This couldn't just be a conversation over dinner. No, this was bigger than that. This was a life-or-death situation, and he couldn't ignore the warning signs. The son nodded, his face pale with fear. "I'll help you. I'll tell you everything I know. But you have to be careful, Dad. She's dangerous. I don't know what she's capable of." His father turned toward him, his expression a mix of confusion and resolve. "What are you talking about? Dangerous how?" The son took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he reached for the wine glass in front of him. "She's been different lately. Not just the phone calls. I overheard her talking about finishing it, that it had to happen soon. She's been planning something, Dad. I think it's more than just poisoning you. I think she's been working with someone I don't recognize, someone you wouldn't expect." The father's stomach dropped. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but it felt like a puzzle that couldn't be completed. "What are you saying? Who's she working with? Do you know who it is?" The son shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "No, but I've seen him before. He's not from around here. I saw him in the office a few weeks ago. He was whispering to her, like they were planning something big." The father clenched his fists, a cold fire beginning to burn in his chest. This was no longer just a betrayal. This was an attack on everything he had built. He had trusted his wife with everything, his empire, his reputation, his life. To think that she had been playing him all this time, that there was someone else in the shadows pulling her strings, it made his blood boil. The realization hit him with a force he couldn't ignore. He had underestimated the danger. The walls he had built around his empire, around his family, were crumbling. His own flesh and blood, the woman he loved, had been working against him, and now he didn't know who he could trust. The father took a deep breath, his mind racing. He needed to confront his wife. He needed answers. But the questions swirling in his head only brought more confusion. Why? Why would she do this to him? What had changed? As he stood there, the weight of his thoughts threatening to crush him, his son's voice broke through. "Dad, I think they're going to make their move tonight. If you don't act now, it might be too late." The father didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. It was time to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. With his son by his side, he turned and headed toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached the threshold, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Where are you going, darling?" His wife's voice was soft, but it sent a chill down his spine. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze across the room. Her eyes held a warmth, but it was the kind of warmth that no longer felt reassuring. It was the look of someone who had something to hide, and in that moment, the father knew the game was just beginning. The father paused at the door, his heart pounding in his chest, as his wife's voice cut through the tense silence of the room. "Where are you going, darling?" Her tone was calm, too calm, and it sent an icy shiver down his spine. He didn't know what to say, how to respond. His entire world felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And here she was, standing, so composed, so confident. His son stood behind him, wide-eyed, frozen in place. The father felt a surge of anger and confusion. How had it come to this? How had he not seen the cracks in their relationship? The warning signs that something was wrong? I need to speak with you," he said, his voice hoarse, betraying the uncertainty gnawing at him. He turned to face her fully, trying to steady his shaking hands. The room felt too small, like the walls were closing in on him, suffocating him. His wife's smile, though warm, now seemed strained. "Of course, darling, but not here. Come with me to the garden. We can talk in private." The father's mind raced. He wanted answers. He needed answers. But a part of him hesitated. Something about her invitation didn't feel right. She had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But now, the roles seemed reversed. And he wasn't sure if he was walking into a trap. "I'll stay here," his son spoke up, his voice trembling. "Dad, be careful. You don't know what she's capable of." The father nodded slowly, giving his son a reassuring look, though he didn't feel reassured at all. He had to confront her. He had to get to the bottom of this madness. They walked through the large French doors, out into the cool night air. The garden was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. The moon cast long shadows on the manicured lawn, and the father felt an unsettling chill as he followed his wife deeper into the garden. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She had always been so composed, so graceful, but now there was something different in her eyes, something cold, almost calculating. "Darling," she began, her voice dripping with sweetness. "I know you must be confused, hurt, maybe even angry, but you don't understand what's at stake here. None of you do." The father felt a chill crawl up his spine as he tried to steady his breath. "What's at stake? What are you talking about? All these years, I trusted you. I built this life with you. And now, this? Poison? Betrayal?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something dark, something sinister, behind the mask of civility she had always worn. "Don't you get it?" she snapped. "This empire you've built, it's not just yours. It never was. We were in this together. But I've done all the work. I've kept everything running behind the scenes, while you were too busy chasing your next big deal. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to ruin everything? You've neglected me, neglected us, for years." The words hit him like a slap. He had always been focused on expanding his empire, on maintaining his position at the top, his marriage, his family. It had all become secondary to the pursuit of success. But to hear her say it so plainly, to see the resentment in her eyes, it was a harsh reality he hadn't wanted to face. "I didn't," he started, but she cut him off. "No, don't. You never even noticed, did you? While you were building your business, I was building resentment, and I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to feel like I mattered again. I wanted power. I wanted control. I was going to take it. And you?" She laughed bitterly. "You never saw it coming." The father's mind reeled as the truth began to sink in. It wasn't just a moment of weakness or desperation. No, this had been years in the making. She hadn't just poisoned his dinner out of anger or fear. She had planned it, manipulated him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, standing here in the dark garden, he realized how much of a fool he had been, blinded by his own ambition. "You think I'm the villain here," she continued, her voice rising with anger. "You think you've done everything. You've done nothing. And now you're too late. The plan's already in motion." The father's heart raced. He didn't understand. "What plan? What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her face inches from his. "The deal. The one I've been negotiating. The one with your biggest rival. I was going to sell everything to them. Everything you've worked for. But not if you're still alive. They'll want your death. It's the only way for them to fully take control." His mind went blank. All this time, his wife had been working behind his back with his enemy, using him as a pawn in some game of business chess he hadn't even known existed. The betrayal was staggering, overwhelming. He had trusted her, loved her, and she had been plotting his demise for months. But as she finished speaking, he felt a shift in the air, an undeniable tension. Something wasn't right. She was too calm, too sure of herself. He glanced around, instinctively aware that he wasn't alone in the garden, and then he heard it. Footsteps behind him. The father spun around, his heart racing, as two figures emerged from the shadows. One was his son. The other was a man he didn't recognize. Tall, imposing, wearing a dark suit. The man stepped forward, a cold smile playing on his lips. "She's right," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You've been a fool, my friend. All this time, we've been setting the stage for the grand finale." The father's mind raced. The man, the business deal. It all came together. In a rush, his wife wasn't just working with him. She had been working with him all along. The poison in his dinner wasn't just a betrayal. It was the beginning of a much larger plan, one that had been in motion for months, orchestrated by the very people he had trusted most. The father turned to his son, who stood by his side, eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want to believe it," his son whispered, "but I had to do something. I couldn't let you walk into this." The father looked back at his wife, the woman he had once loved. The world he had spent so many years building now seemed like nothing more than sand, slipping through his fingers. The empire, the family, it was all a lie. And in that moment, he realized there was only one way out. "Get away from her," he commanded his son, his voice low but firm. "This is over." With a final desperate glance at his wife, the father made his choice. He turned and walked away, not looking back, knowing that the empire he had built was no more. And as the cold night air pressed against his skin, He realized that in the end, the most valuable thing wasn't wealth or power, it was trust, and he had lost it all.